we give generals quite an easy ride, in my view, and we give politicians a really difficult ride. And that was evidenced from the questions and answers in the first session, I felt. Yeah, and the question about why was Grant considered a great general, but, you know, a bit iffy as president, at least iffy. I mean, you know, the sleaze allegations that we've had over the past while would pale into insignificance compared with the corruption allegations under President Grant. And I do think it's something that we should be exploring a bit more, because I think it has a wider implication. Let's have a look at, assuming I can get this thing to now work.
Try it with that.
Try it with the right. So I think the largest challenge in any war is about losing the will to win. And I think that that's really important. You know, look at the recent Afghan war. That is President Ashraf Ghani, who skedaddled rather quickly when the Taliban were at the gates of Kabul. You know, the National Army of Afghanistan had weapons galore supplied by courtesy of mainly US taxpayers, but a bit by UK taxpayers. They had training courtesy of Western armies. Somewhere no one is quite sure because of all the fiddling that went on. They had at least 300,000 people on their payroll, possibly even 400,000 on their payroll. And they lose to a bunch of people who are armed with nothing more than RPGs and machine gun, the odd rifle, and some other fairly simple weaponry. You translate it back to the Civil War and you think, okay, you know, sort of the South had a lot less weaponry and men, but it didn't have to lose. You know, these guys were very much, the Taliban were very much outnumbered and outgunned, and yet it was the forces who had all the weapons, all the technology, all the help, all the money. They lost and lost catastrophically within a few weeks. Unless you think this is an unusual example, of course, we can go back to 1975, Saigon, the final days, the well-known photograph of people desperately escaping via helicopters on the roof of the US Embassy. And you can see again, it was not really a question about the weaponry, but it's about the will to win. That's more in the political stage. And then there's a question of priorities. So this is a famous picture of Lord Cornwallis surrendering to the French and the Americans. And the French actually spent an absolute fortune giving a huge banquet to the British at that time. I'm not sure President Macron would have done that, but it's a different matter. But what is important about that is, of course, the priorities. One of the things that is less looked at in terms of the American Revolution, why Britain lost, was that this was third on our level of priorities. We wanted to stop invasion of the home islands. We wanted to protect our West Indian and other colonies. The American colonies were very much seen as the third priority, but also in a political sense, very different. You have the opposition Whigs, people like Charles James Fox, who are openly toasting American victories. And you have a very divided political society in Britain, but interesting, nobody gets locked up in the UK in Britain, it's before the UK, no one gets locked up in Britain for supporting the American patriots. But it shows how politics is very important. If you took the two sides, took the number of American defeats, the general quality of their generalship, which wasn't brilliant, but they did have the advantage of powerful friends in terms of the French. And of course, Britain, very much, it was a low priority, which is why we gave so much away at the Peace of Paris. in 1783. And then you get what I call the nearly men. And this is why I think politics is so important in this. Most of you will recognize, I assume, the middle chap there, Anthony Eden. Anthony Eden. So is British forces got within, what was it, 10 miles of the end of the canal before there was a general funk at the idea of the US withdrawing support from the pound, and we stopped having gone in but not completed the job. As Churchill once said, it was brave to go in, it was even braver to stop 3/4 of the way through. He certainly wouldn't have done that. And I'll come back to Churchill shortly. The other nearly men of this would be Wudi, the Emperor Wudi, who decided that the barbarians of the north, the Xiongnu, should be treated with constant warfare until he nearly bankrupted the Chinese Empire, showing that warfare has its limits, even when you're Emperor of the Chinese. And then, of course, this gentleman who no one will recognize, of course, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, who came very close in 1585, 1586 to subduing the rebellious Dutch provinces and there's a very famous painting of him taking Breda, B-R-E-D-A, which was seen as almost the death knell for the Dutch revolt. Then, of course, Philip II decides that he's going to transfer his attention to England. We get the English project, the Armada, and the Dutch recover a lot of the ground that they'd lost because priorities change. And he would have been known as the conqueror of the United Provinces had Philip II not pulled the rug from under him with the disastrous Armada. And then, of course, you get military leaders who succeed against all the odds. So you could talk about Ho Chi Minh, for example, against both the French and the Americans. But my big examples of that would be Frederick the Great. Why Frederick the Great? Well, in the 7 Years' War, he managed to take on the French, the Austrians, the Russians, the Saxons, and he still managed to survive for 7 years. If you looked at that, you would say the Confederacy's chances were hugely greater than the Prussians, who, of course, also had and suffered from no natural defensible frontiers. So we'll talk about for a long time. But an interesting element, there is a possibility of someone surviving against all the odds, able to sort of reduce the alliance against him, and also to use the internal lines of communication. Came very close to defeat, but wasn't. And of course, you have Arminius, Hermann the German, AD 9, wins the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest against Augustus. Varus, who has 3 legions who are lost, and Emperor Augustus at that point decides, no, we're not going to go further into Germany. We're going to stick by the Rhine. And there you have the division in modern day Europe between those who are Teutonic and drink beer and those who are Latin and drink wine and olives. The Latin temperament versus the Teutonic, still the case. But interesting enough, of course, what there was after that was this collapse of political will. In essence, that was seen as Augustus saying, thus far and no further. They could have sent lots of legions out to reverse that. They don't do that for a long time. And they've decided this is as far as we'll go. And political will is always extremely important. But the point I want to come to is that you look at generals, and the question always comes up, why are very successful generals like Grant, or I visited earlier today, Apsley House, the home of the great Duke of Wellington. Why are these generally successful generals unable to translate that success into politics? And I think One of the reasons is that generals have much fewer challenges in terms of warfare, particularly pre, if you like, 21st century warfare. Their challenge is to muster the army's strength, the concentration of forces. Jackson would have said, getting there with the most, the fastest with the most. It's either him or it was who's it? Yeah. Achieving strategic success and achieving tactical success. And we have plenty of generals who are lauded for their tactical success, but don't manage strategic success. Lee would be a good example of that, generally speaking. And we have some who don't seem to be so good on tactical success, Grant, I would argue, but are incredibly good at strategic success, moving people forward. But it's a limited number of things that you've got to do. Whereas a politician's challenges are hugely greater and are therefore much more susceptible to criticism. Maintaining that coalition of will amongst all your side to keep going. Why did the British lose America? Why did the Americans lose Vietnam? Why did we lose in Afghanistan? Why did Augustus not attack further in Germany? On that basis, it's because the maintenance of coalition of will is really important. You lose that, you lose the war. You've got to feed the armies. You've got to make sure that all the supplies get to them. You need to feed the people. You don't want riots in your main cities like in Richmond on that basis. You need to organize the supplies both to the military and the civilians who are supporting the military. You therefore need to maintain the economy, prioritize, and this is always the real difficult question for any politician because they're going to upset somebody, prioritizing the allocation of resources, both in war and in peace. The prioritization of the allocation of resources is the key role. Where does your tax money go? What do I spend on? What do I cut? And in the case of the Americans, maintaining their position, relationship with the governors, who are much more important then, arguably, than they are now. So let's have a look at this further. Whoops. And then if you look at the American context, you can see how difficult this becomes. Yep. They've got to keep decent relationships with Congress. Not an easy position. It's not like you've got an army and you just tell your subordinates what to do, which you can do up to an extent. Of course, you can go too far, like Braxton Bragg did. But this is a much more difficult challenge. You need to worry about what is going on in the courts, particularly the Supreme Court. You've got to worry about your own party, remember, which may be very different from the considerations of Congress or Parliament. You've got to worry about foreign governments. Are they going to intervene? The key to Confederate success would have been if one major foreign power intervenes, that would, in my view, have tipped the balance on what was a very evenly based conflict. The press, of course, much easier to have if you've got a press, people like Horace Greeley and others, easy to find that you're on the wrong side of the press. And of course, the press, remember, today's press is tomorrow's toilet paper, or certainly in the 19th century. Maybe we wrap fish and chips in it these days. But effectively, they also forget when they back the wrong horse or made mistakes. Cabinet. Having a cohesive cabinet, hugely important. And then, of course, your decent relationship with the military. It's a much, much bigger role. And arguably, it is impossible to get all of those elements right because some of them will contradict others. The press is hounding you for intervention on the Trent affair, and you're thinking, no, that's a very easy way to lose a war, isn't it? You can't please everyone all the time. Let's look at some of the generals who become presidents. So who's this? Jackson. So I'm not sure quite if he's been cancelled yet. It's only a matter of time. The Vale of the Tears and so on. General Jackson, hugely anti-British, won, however, the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, then became a very peppery type president. I don't think he'd gone down well today. He would have sort of be a Trump-like character, but only slightly more so, in my opinion, than Trump. But again, relatively successful in his own terms as president. But most of the others are not. Eisenhower, good general in terms of, there are arguments about elements of his performance, but generally seen as successful. He was on the winning side. He did do what he was supposed to do, and seen as a successful general who then becomes a president. I think it's fair to say that his period of presidency from 52 to 60 would be seen as medium. Nothing, he didn't make many mistakes, but he didn't actually achieve a great deal. It was a period of a certain amount of stability, and he improved his golf, as far as I know. His big mistake was Suez, and he always said, back the wrong side on Suez. Our friend Ulysses S. Grant, there are people, you can always find people who will defend a president, but generally speaking, the waves of corruption were definitely seen as a blot on not necessarily him personally, but the people he chose and trusted in his cabinet and dealings with. And then, of course, dear George Washington, who was not the greatest general in the world, but had various slices of life. That's why he never wrote a book about how he won the American Revolution, because it would have been shown too much. It was really on a wing and a prayer. As a president, again, he termed it the impossible job. Tells you what he thought about it. And of course, he was subject to huge amounts of criticism when he was president. And politicians' reputations, quite often, like wine, get better with a bit of aging. Others, I don't think you'll recognize them all. I mean, you could talk about a huge number of presidents who fought somewhere in the military, were somewhere in the military. Anyone recognize any of these people?
Harrison, Tyler, Pierce.
It is very good. Yeah, Harrison, Tyler, and Pierce. So we've got three relatively all right generals. None of them seen as anything particularly great as presidents. So if you're thinking military good, politicians, what did you say about them? Crooks, I think, Derek. Then, the military is not a good training ground to make a successful politician, particularly an elected politician. Then I go for the even more obscure ones here. So we've got Benjamin Harrison. Didn't he get killed or something? Yeah. I've got, oh God, I've now forgotten the names of them. Garfield, yes. I was going to put a little cat by him so that you can remember who he was.
Garfield, Harrison.
And well, this one says Harrison, so that's a giveaway. Right. Again, none of them seen, you can see them in their Civil War uniforms, none of them seen as shooting the lights out as president by any means. And part of it, I think, is a tribute also to the fact that until the 20th century, particularly the advent of the First and Second World War, there wasn't the same centralization of power, so the amount a president had to do was less. But it is interesting, you take your best people, allegedly, people who have some degree of prestige and experience, you put them as president, and the best you can say about them is that they're mediocre. Okay, who can get this one? And the hint is in the film. Now, before you answer, what? Bruce Willis, yeah? So what is the connection between Bruce Willis and this one? Anybody know?
Is it Taft?
No, it's not Taft, not Robert Taft.
Arthur.
Chester Arthur. And he appears in, if you've ever seen Die Hard 2, it's Die Hard 3, sorry. Die Hard 3 with Bruce Willis and Samuel Jackson. One of the clues to get round is the number, which is the number of the president, and they have to go and rescue people at the Chester Arthur School. Remember that this guy was, of course, quartermaster general, I think, in New York. He was bigged up in New York, but never saw any action. So I thought I would include him. But, you know, again, Chester A. Arthur, he's probably best known for featuring in Die Hard rather than anything else.
He's from my hometown. His parents' house is a museum.
Is it?
It's lovely town.
Okay, so we've worked out it's not an easy job being president. It might be the impossible job, but there's also a question of what we call the elective challenge. And I would say that the elective challenge are different. One was to create a nation, famously, as Gladstone said. Jeff Davis, more importantly than creating an army or a navy, was to create a nation. I think a bit premature on that. And the Union idea was to create a sustainable coalition for victory. I would argue both very difficult tasks. The challenges for both sides were very small in military infrastructure, large, sparsely populated areas that, amongst the other things, with the vast distances, defeated the British in the American Revolution. A lot of local and state autonomy. You would argue more in the South than in the North. You could argue about, did the South died of states' rights? Whether that's true or not, I don't know. It's certainly an arguable case, and very limited central powers, particularly in the South. What are the elements of diplomatic power? And here I look at a very interesting talk on YouTube. So I've taken various elements, and I will give credit for it in it, but somebody or other, his name will come back to me. Diplomatic, what are the elements of state power? Diplomatic, information, military, economic, and he adds in political. Those are the elements of state power that you need to get your levers, adjust your levers with. And this comes from comparing, look at North and South. If you compare the indices there, what you can see is obviously we're all aware of the huge advantage the North had in terms of population, same in the size of the economy. Critically with railroad mileage, I'll come back to that as a point. Merchant shipping, unsurprising, although the South has quite a large coastline. Naval ships as well. Factory production, firearms production, iron production, farm acreage, and the only advantage the South has is cotton production. Huge challenge in terms of the South winning. But as I've argued with other cases that we've talked about in history now that I've mentioned, not insuperable. But from a political point of view, you need to negate the advantages the North has. From the North's point of view, it needs to bring that weight in order to take advantage and make sure that it can keep the will to win going. And of course, what does Jefferson Davis do to negate his advantage in cotton production? He starts with an embargo, possibly the craziest policy ever, but under this huge illusion that a cotton embargo would lead the Europe to intervene, possibly his biggest and most disastrous mistake from an economic perspective. Imagine if he had shipped over the cotton harvest of 1860-61, put it in bonded warehouses in Liverpool, asked for gold for it. A lot of the economic problems, the supply problems they had, would not have occurred to the extent they did, the hyperinflation and all the economic dislocation, if they'd taken the opportunity before the blockade got serious to ship that cotton, put it in bonded warehouses and collect the money. So this is Bud Bowie. It's a great lecture on Jefferson Davis. And despite being a Southerner, he rather lays into it. But it's actually a very good lecture. If you've got an hour to spend on YouTube, I would look at it. I'd consider actually bringing him over at a conference. I thought he was very entertaining. So it's a lecture given in 2012. Choose your war leader. Okay? we talk about politics and we talk about experience. I hopefully have shown that a lot of the generals who were actually quite good in the Civil War turned out to be less than satisfactory when they became to be president, partly as a result of the job, the inherent difficulties of being president, but in my view, partly also because being a politician, being an elected representative, has very different skills, as we saw from Ulysses S. Grant. He did climb up the political tree, but maybe his failures helped him on that basis. But if you had a CV, if you were choosing someone for president and just on the CV, would you choose someone who'd been to Transylvania and West Point? This is not Romania, but West Point, celebrated war hero, successful entrepreneur, influential congressman, secretary of war, as was mentioned by Neil before, a national party leader and a distinguished senator? Or are you going to choose someone who's self-educated, his only experience in the military is militia, a failed small businessman, failed congressman, local lawyer, leader of a radical party, French party, and a failed Senate candidate? Now, of course, we know who we are likely to choose. Well, that would be a picture of Abraham Lincoln if there wasn't a Zoom thing in the way. And of course, that's Jefferson Davis. And we know who ends up much better. I think it's a fair comment to make. I'll be interested if anyone disagrees. Had you swapped presidents, the South would have won. Abraham Lincoln had the abilities that Jefferson Davis clearly failed. And it was a close run thing. I mean, the number of times the South could, with a slight change, might have gained its independence. I think you swap leaders, they do. Happy to take a different view. Remembering, how big is this? I mean, the British were only worried about this area. Well, a small area with the proclamation line, and all we had to do was hold enough of that, and we failed miserably. Well, miserably, maybe that's a little far, but we did fail in the end. You're trying to get something which is an empire in extent. You're trying to make sure your border states don't end up going somewhere else, right? And you've got your original cotton states, the four who join after Sumter, and then you've got your four border states that you want to keep in play. This is a huge job. If, for example, the politicians like Davis had played it better, with a better strategy, can you imagine a Confederacy which has Missouri, which has Kentucky, and has Maryland? At that point, you're thinking to yourself, guys, I look at the blue side, it's not very big. It's got to occupy all that other area. It's not going to work. The fact that politically they managed to lose all those border states is, in my view, one of the major reasons why the Confederacy was always fighting with one hand behind its back. If he'd done it right and not got his mate Polk, for example, Bishop Polk, to invade Kentucky, then, if you're looking at it from the northern side, Kentucky is neutral. It's a very good defensive mechanism against an invasion of West, where the Confederacy is weakest. That's why I think politics is so important in this. And that's why Lincoln does so well, because he effectively takes all the border states and parts of Virginia. Of course, in terms of the what we know about the allocation, the priority of resources, we know that effectively between Richmond and Washington until 1864, the armies move up and down, but there's no decisive action, or there's no decisive point there. But we do know that, of course, the Union, with the one exception of Chickamauga, made consistent progress in terms of battles, major battles that they win on the Mississippi and then in Tennessee. So effectively, Davis prioritizes Richmond over the West, with one big exception, of course, when he sends his troops under Longstreet to Chickamauga, and they take part in the only major victory the South has in that area. And you think to yourself, okay, you've done it, that succeeded, perhaps you ought to think about it again. Davis also left lots of garrisons all over the place and didn't do what politicians hate to do, but are sometimes forced to do, which is that they have to disappoint people in those isolated garrisons and say the most important armies, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee, and I need my troops there. And if I have to give up something on the coast, so be it. I need two strong armies. And whereas Lincoln had the luxury, of course, this huge preponderance of numbers, Jefferson Davis had to make decisions, and generally, with a few exceptions, funked them, in my view. Of course, we know that what happens in 1863, it goes from bad to worse. The Confederacy is cut in two, and at that point, you do think to yourself, it's going to be difficult. There we have the 64. It's still quite a large area. It's a much larger area than the British were looking to conquer 75 years before. But generally speaking, you can see the strategy. You've cut the Confederacy in two, and Davis has a number of choices, and again, doesn't get them right. But they're always difficult choices. How far do you strip your only successful army and put them down there to stop Sherman? Do you put your best general against Sherman and hope that the natural geography of Virginia will keep Grant at bay? Could have done that, didn't do it, and there are arguments on both sides. If you read a book called Two Great Rebel Armies, they would argue that actually he should have done the reverse. He should have traded space down here and tried to win a decisive victory up there where the South had some comparative advantages, the rivers going laterally, not down, small elements like that. So again, the allocation of resources, which becomes all that much more important if you're a president of a country with inferior numbers. The greatest challenge is also finding the right people for the right jobs. Limited pools of talent and experience. Remember that America had paid a lot of obeisance to their taxpayers who didn't want to spend lots of money when they didn't think they had any particularly important enemies. And therefore, the amount of experience with an army was always relatively small. And therefore, you were relying on regular officers who had been educated at West Point. But the difficulty with regular officers is they may be tied to certain ways of doing things. But of course, they all had their own strong points. So despite what Neil said, you couldn't get much better trainer and somebody to form an army than McClellan. Once he'd formed it, he felt it was so precious to him, he'd never use it. But he was pretty good at licking the Army of Potomac into some form of shape. Right? As a trainer, you'd want him. Our mate Burnside, you would probably say, well, he did improve conditions for a while. He had some good plans. I mean, the Fredericksburg plan was not a bad plan. The direction was terribly faulty. So again, maybe his strength is not tactics, much more strategy, because his plan was good and nearly worked. Irving McDowell, well, a bit early, sort of early generals, never a great idea. And of course, our friend Hooker, who at least had the idea, the first elements in the Chancellorsville campaign were actually, again, pretty good, but he lost his nerve. How would you know he would lose his nerve, given how confident he was? He said that I lost faith in General Hooker. Of course, there are some real turnips that we're best off sending off to the West to fight Native Americans. So John Pope, nobody has ever managed to defend of any sort. So, but what I'm trying to say is you did. Oh, dreadful general. Greg is, of course, the patron saint of lost causes, but I've never actually seen anybody really defend Pope. But within this group, you've got people who have talents, but not necessarily putting round pegs in square holes. Limited pools of talent and experience. Going a little bit further than that, of course, who is that? Polk, yes, Bishop Polk, particularly useless. Again, a real problem with Polk, of course, is that he's a mate of Davis, and so therefore that's a real problem, because he manages to lose Kentucky and quite a bit of the West as well. Who's this? Hello? Well, hello. Pillow. Yeah, I come on to Pillow later on. But again, why do I look at Pillow? I'll come back to him later. Political generals. So, now you might think to yourself, well, what did Clausewitz say about politics? War is a continuation of politics by other means. So you might think that political generals would be a good idea. However, if I look at them, there's Ben Butler. Now, again, Greg will defend Ben Butler, but, give him his due. He did manage to keep New Orleans pretty quiet after the initial problems with what he said, which was a he would say was taken out of context. It's always good line. His attitude, the attitude that they should have been. So remember what he said was that a lot of federal troops were being abused by the women, and he said, well, you should treat them like they're the women of the street. He didn't mean for them to be assaulted. What he meant was you should ignore them, just like you would do, hopefully, women of the afternoon. Yes, women of the street. So he didn't do that very well in 1864. He didn't go very far, do very much. But he certainly wasn't as bad as all that compared with some of the other generals. Who are the others here?
Franz Sigel.
Franz Sigel. Now, Franz Sigel is, of course, a particularly useless general. And had you looked at his CV, you'd have seen he did fight in Germany in 1848, but he lost, and lost badly.
To the Badenese army, which I didn't even know existed.
The Badenese, which is Baden-Baden, I think, yes. So he did lose there. Why was he chosen?
Germans.
Brought the Germans, yes. He brought a lot of Germans with him. Now, you might criticize Lincoln for that, but the point is, Lincoln was dependent on keeping a coalition of the willing to get him through, to keep the popular support, to keep the recruits going, and eventually to get elected. Even if you take out the election business, he needs the German community on his side, and he needs a recognizable general there. You can understand it is a question of what's the point of only having the generals from one section of society if I lose everybody else and nobody else is prepared to fight? And then you've got, who's he?
Fremont.
That is Fremont. My God, they're very good. Fremont. This group knows its stuff. Haven't heard anything from the Zoom people. They'd probably fall asleep by now. But Fremont, of course, ultimate political general, wants to free the slaves long before anybody else does. Not particularly good, but why does Lincoln need them? Well, he needs the radical side on board as well. This is the issue with running a war when you've got an active Congress, active elections, active governors. And so, therefore, you need to understand from Lincoln's point of view, he's got to keep everyone on board. Who's probably the most successful political general, in my view? Breckinridge. He would be my choice to lead the Western Army. I'd have had him number one, and I'd have had our man Claiborne number two. Different result there. You know, if you swap the failing team of Polk, retreating Joe Johnston, and Hood, for him and Claiborne, you've got a winning combination, haven't you? Really, you know. He does actually very well as Secretary of State for War. He's only there for a couple of months, and suddenly the Confederate supplies are all getting to the right people in the right places. There are trainloads of supplies. It's a shame that some of them are captured by Yankee cavalry, but actually he gets it moving. But it's getting the right people in the right place at the right time. Of course, I've got two here, but they are not in the Pope category. Pope was useless at everything. I haven't found out whether he was happily married like Grant or not. But who's on the left? Braxton Bragg. What does he do extremely well?
Upset everyone.
No, apart from upset everyone, what does he do very well? No. Well, he does lose a bit. He did win Chickamauga, right? Only victory.
Biggest fall is one step at a time. That's what I was told.
Well, maybe in command of the army, but if you look at his subsequent career as advisor to Jefferson Davis, he provides Jefferson Davis with a very useful support, so that Jefferson Davis is not ill all the time, but secondly, some quite useful advice. In essence, he's not great at leading and inspiring troops, but he is good as an advisor. In the same way that Burnside might have actually been quite good as an advisor to President Lincoln, but he's not good in front of troops. Who's this guy? It's Pillow. What does Pillow do extremely well? Absolutely. 1864, the Confederacy come May has recovered its losses and more, because he is in charge of getting people back, and he is ruthless about doing it. So it's not a question that 1863 Gettysburg is the turning point. By May 1864, the Confederate armies are back to the strength and more that they were before Gettysburg and all the disasters in 1863. You find the right person, you find the right place for them. And nobody can do everything. Nobody's good at everything. But interestingly enough, by 1864, he's found the right advisor in the right place, and he's found the right recruitment person. He then goes and dissipates it by not deciding to concentrate his forces again. He spreads them out and rather misses the golden opportunities that those two have given him. But it's difficult. You've got people saying, I need protection here, I need protection there. I'm the governor of this state. What are you going to do about me? You know, it's not an easy job. It's easy for us to look by hindsight. But my argument would be is you find the right roles for experienced people. Of course, you have people who are the wrong person at the wrong time. Our mate Hood, of course, after he's lost, was it an arm and a leg? I can't always remember how many limbs he lost. Yeah. You know, putting him in charge is just, you know, slightly short of madness. You know, the guys on laudanum and other drugs to keep the pain down, you know, it's not something with hindsight that you can say was wrong. Even people at the time, the Army of Tennessee, the main soldiers thought that when Johnston went and was replaced by Hood, that this was a bad move. So it wasn't the benefit of hindsight. If I look at him in the middle, who's he? Rosie. Now, Rosie is just plain unfortunate. He maneuvers the Confederate army out of Tennessee without paying a single battle. I mean, it's an amazing strategic achievement, you know. And then, of course, he's done in politically by Grant. Not, I think, as quite as angelic as we made out, but Rosie does pretty well. And then, of course, he loses the Battle of Chickamauga. So, why is, I think, politics important is because I think that the Civil War was generally won and lost by political skill. President Lincoln carefully selects his department secretaries to bring in diverse skills and perspectives into his cabinet. You can read the team of rivals, you can talk about a lot of people who thought that they were better than Lincoln. He was this overgrown buffoon. I mean, they would talk about him in terms that would be unacceptable in the 21st century. He recognised his cabinet appointments offered a valuable opportunity to build coalitions and strengthen tenuous bonds between factions remaining in the Union. There's no point just having one faction, however good they are, if you lose everybody else and lose the will to fight. First of all, he selected former Republican rivals for the most important cabinet positions. So Senator William H. Seward of New York became Secretary of State. Governor Salmon P. Chase of Ohio became Secretary of the Treasury, and he was pretty good at that. And Missouri's elder statesman, Edward Bates, became the Attorney General. These appointments also extended representation to crucial states from the Northeast, Old Northwest, and the border states. Keep in mind the coalition of the willing. Next, Lincoln appointed former Democrats to build bipartisan support. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy, Postmaster General Montgomery Blair, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. One can argue about their performances, particularly Stanton's, but he does need a cabinet that's going to bring the war united front, just like Churchill had to do when he brought in various members of the Labour Party and the Liberals into his war cabinet. I look at Jefferson Davis's cabinet. I mean, I think that's right. Diddly, diddly, diddly. It just doesn't match up. The only one who was really successful was the Postmaster General, who kept the Confederate postal system going right the way through. He replaces most of the people. This does not mean that they're all bad. Judah P. Benjamin was seen as one of the cleverest people in the United States of any sort. And from that point of view, the first Missouri planter, but so good that in an age where, sort of people did not, there was a fair amount of anti-Semitism, the first Jewish Secretary of State in any cabinet in the United States. So you had people of talent, but they tend to rub each other up the wrong way. He is like there, standing like a trooper, and that's pretty much him. He's very, very inflexible. And he shuffles his pack far too often. In 4 years, he has 4 secretaries of state, which are the people dealing with foreign affairs, 5 attorney generals, and 6 secretaries of war. When you're fighting a civil war, that is not a good way of dealing with things. And I would argue that a lot of the weaknesses of the Confederacy come down to that. There's no central direction. There's no way of carrying it forward. You can always tell a government that goes from bad to worse is when they keep on changing the ministers every 2 minutes. A bit like they did with the end of the May government.
Trump.
No, well, interesting enough, Mr. Trump did that. But actually, interesting enough, if you look at David Cameron, he kept roughly the same ministers right the way through at least until 2015. And Boris Johnson has generally been quite cautious about changing ministers. Wants to give them at least a couple of years to prove themselves or not, as the case may be. Otherwise, why was Gavin Williamson there for 2 years? Yeah, you can look at people and see, actually, there's a real temptation for presidents and prime ministers to reshuffle their cabinet in answer to the next press campaign. But the wise ones don't. They give you time to get used to a job. Like any other job, you need time to find your feet. Jefferson Davis didn't do that. The other element which I find worrying is that in doing an impossible job, and this is nearly an impossible job, people are less forgiving about politicians than they are in almost any other walk of life, in my opinion. You look at a famous picture of President Lincoln and you can see how he has aged, how the burdens of office have aged him. He has paid a huge personal cost for this. And the same is true, but probably to a lesser extent, of Jefferson Davis on that basis. And we ask people to do the almost impossible job, and we ignore the fact the effect on their health becomes almost intolerable. And that was the case in the 19th century. Arguably, it's the case today as well. I went to the Churchill War Rooms on Wednesday with my father, It's quite interesting because he remembered the sirens for real. That's a bit different when you go with somebody who remembers. They do a siren. He said that was the all clear, that was all right. The other siren was the one when they're coming over, and boy oh boy, and he remembered all the bits about the evacuation song. But I thought it was interesting. Again, you've got a difficult bit of zooming away, but he is quite the most difficult man to work with. But I should not have missed the chance of working with him for anything on earth. That was one of Churchill's strongest critics, who was Alan Brooke. And of course, when you look at Churchill, he was made for 1940. As my father said, he had a bit of a checkered career before then. He certainly had a checkered career afterwards. In terms of losing the landslide election in 45, and came back and was a bit like Ike in the 1950s. But give the man, give the hour. And if you look at it, that is very much the case. But look at the cost he bore as well. Churchill's work pace, this is in CW, Churchill War Rooms, work pace during the war would have defeated many younger men. He drove his staff very hard, but he drove himself even harder. Churchill regularly worked 18-hour days. He carried on working on weekends and travelled abroad many times a year to conferences and battlefronts. Churchill was physically and mentally tough. His family gave him a great deal of support, something which unfortunately Lincoln didn't really get from his family, partly because most of them were fighting for the South, particularly on his wife's side of the family. But the war took its toll on his health. Twice he became very seriously ill, nearly died of pneumonia twice. And towards the end of the war, he began to show signs of exhaustion. And interesting enough, when we talk about the people who are our elected representatives, we underestimate the physical toll that this has. It's gone again, hasn't it? It is. No. So I have one final question for you. Is this a question of terminology? We think of politicians and we always think in a negative way. The term politician has become very negative, which I think is worrying in a democracy. Because in a democracy, I would say that politicians are also our elected representatives. And they are very often representative of both our good points and our weaknesses, our internal struggles that we have. Just like politicians borrow too much money from the state, hoping something, the state borrows too much money to fund projects. How often do we max out on the credit card or get ourselves into financial problems? Just as we sometimes want lots of things but are unsure how to pay for them, is that not the same thing with politicians? When politicians anguish over different priorities, how often do we in our lives anguish over different priorities? And if we have politicians who are either corrupt or corrupt or incompetent, how often does that reflect the choices that we've made, because they are our elected representatives?
But you don't know they're corrupt until after you've elected.
You can have a look. And then we'll come back to that. My final point about that is, in a system where we have gone, in the world where we've gone from, under Senator Patrick Daniel Moynihan famously said in the UN in about 1975, there were about 25 democracies in the world. Most of them had emanated from the British Empire, I may add, British Commonwealth and Empire. We've had a huge expansion of democracy, fall of the Berlin Wall, Latin America, even in parts of Asia. We are now seeing democracy under threat by rival ideologies such as the Chinese, which say you can have economic progress and political repression, or by the Russians, who believe that you can just have political repression. I think it's very difficult in judging people that we want to govern us, that we judge them by a different standard to almost everything else in life. And I think that creates an undue degree of cynicism that is not only bad for our politics, bad for us, our society, but bad for our futures as well.